Right. I think, are we good to get started?
I think we're good. Welcome,
All
everybody.
right. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to LogicPrep's webinar on navigating the new ACT. I'm Marissa, one of our academic advisors here, and I'm joined tonight by two of my wonderful colleagues, two of our senior tutors, Gretchen and Jamie. And we know that testing updates can often feel overwhelming. So, our hope tonight is to ease your anxiety because even though it can be frustrating to have to learn a new ACT format, there are some advantages to this new version too. So, in this webinar tonight, we plan to go through the following. Oh, there we go. So, we're going to talk a little about the timeline so that you have a sense of what's to come and when changes are coming. We're going to talk about what the changes are. And we're going to talk about scoring and an admission perspective from our perspectives of what we know so far, what the changes actually mean for students and for testing. And then we'll do a summary. And of course, we will also leave time for questions at the end. So feel free to add your questions into the Q&A box during the webinar, and we can answer anything that comes up at the end as well. All right. So let's go ahead and get started with the timeline. So the first new version, which they are calling the enhanced version, will be in April. And this is only going to be the digital version. The paper-based April exam will be the current version. The September exam will be the enhanced version for both digital and paper-based. So we really want to reiterate the fact that students still have February, June, and July to take the current version. You can go to the next slide. And for all of our visual learners here, we have this wonderful chart so that you can kind of see what the timing looks like. And just a note for students who are taking the ACT in person on specific dates sponsored by school districts, the enhanced version, the new version, won't be available in high schools until spring of 2026. So you still have some more time for that as well.
So now I'll talk a little bit about the changes to the content and the format of the test. I would say the nicest thing is that there are no significant changes to the concepts and skills tested. So for any of you who have been studying for the current ACT, everything that you've been working on will show up on this new test. Um, the sort of shift is just going to be that they're changing some of the emphasis between the different reporting categories, meaning some topics are getting de-emphasized, others are getting a greater emphasis, but there are no new reporting categories. So every type of question that you've been looking at for the current paper-based test is still going to show up on this new shorter test. Changes to the format are more significant. And so it is a shorter test, both because there are fewer questions and because the science section is now optional. Um, they are giving more time per question in all of the sections except for the science. They're giving question stems for every question in English, which allows more clarity, I think, in terms of how students are supposed to approach each question. And finally, they're having 4 answer choices in all sections. For some reason, they always had 5 in the math and 4 in all of the others. So now it's just going to be uniform across the whole test. And another big shift is that there are going to be experimental questions incorporated into all of the sections of the test, which will allow them to shorten it more because students won't have to take the 5th section that they currently take during the real test. That was their experimental section. So to go a little bit more into the details of the format changes, the English section is getting shortened from 45 to 35 minutes. They're cutting off 25 questions though. So it's going from 36 seconds per question to 42 seconds per question, and the passages are going to be shorter. The math is going from 60 questions in 60 minutes to 45 questions in 50 minutes, gives you about an extra 7 seconds per question. Reading is going from 35 minutes to 40 minutes, and it's getting cut from 40 questions to 36 questions. So that's going to give you about an extra 15 seconds per question. In the science section, it is staying optional, or it is now going optional. It's giving an extra 5 minutes for the same number of questions, so about 7.5 seconds per question. They cut out the experimental section, which makes the whole test a little bit shorter and friendlier. And the writing, which has been optional for years now, is still going to be optional. So the total testing time, not including breaks, is getting cut from 3 hours and 15 minutes to 2 hours and 5 minutes, or 2 hours and 45 minutes if you take the science.
Okay, so we have a little bit of here about what the new composite score is going to look like. So previously, the ACT composite score was English, math, reading, science, clean average of those four. Going forward with the new enhanced version, it's going to be the average of just the English, math, and the reading. So the science is going to get reported separately, still out of the 36. Writing will be reported separately, just as it is now. It's at a 12. If you take the science, then they will average the math and science to give you a STEM score. If you take the writing, they're going to combine the English reading and the writing to give you an ELA score. So here's just a little bit of what that's going to look like. This is a score example with science and writing kind of as it currently is. So again, now science is mandatory, writing is optional. You wouldn't necessarily have to take the writing for here. So the composite here is out of the 4 sections that are highlighted in orange, as you can see. Math, science, English, and reading. Writing is there, but it's just reported separately. It does not get included into that overall 29 composite. And then the STEM score here is just derived from the math and science, while the ELA derived from the English, reading, and science. So this is how it currently stands. With the new version, if we had the student take the same exact test, still opt in for science, now that it's optional, still opt in for writing. The composite now is just going to be the average of the math, English, and reading. Your science is still going to be reported along with the writing if you take it, just separately, not included into that overall average. If you take science, you'll get a STEM score. If you don't, you won't. And if you take writing, you'll get an ELA score. If you don't, you won't, which is the current way which is how it currently works for the writing. So Marissa's going to share now a little bit about how this is going to look from the college admissions perspective.
Yes, let's talk about the perspective here. So Gretchen talked about scoring changes in more detail, but what admissions officers will be concerned with is that the scores are still out of that 36, just with 3 core sections and science as an added section if students opt to take that part. So ACT's internal research shows that the score for the new version without the science component is comparable to the composite score for the traditional exam. Basically, the ACT wanted to phase in the implementation process and give state partners and school districts time to adjust to the changes. So for at least one application cycle, colleges will have to receive the ACT scores from 2 different formats, the new and the current. So admissions offices will have to evaluate these as essentially the same tests. So we'll probably see that colleges will likely adjust their evaluation processes slightly to account for the changes in the score scales or the test design. So in talking about the science section, in terms of taking the science section, our best guess is that some schools will want to see this section, maybe especially for STEM-based majors, or will encourage STEM-based majors to submit. We don't fully know just yet, but I always say if a student is really strong in one area, like if they're scoring high in science, they should include those scores because we always want the application to highlight all academic strengths. And then as with anything new admissions related, there are also lots of unknowns here too. So right now, colleges know the ACT is changing, but they are knee-deep in evaluating applications and preparing recruitment initiatives for next cycle. So you're not going to find every school releasing their policy updates just yet. But we should continue to watch some schools sharing policy to coincide with the new ACT version. I imagine that most schools will evaluate the core composite ACT, the math, the English, and the reading, similarly to how they evaluate the current composite score. And then we'll treat that science as an add-on, kind of like what they've always done for the writing section. Always go directly to the college's website to check policy updates. Like, for example, we see on Brown's website now that they have already noted that they will be optional for the science section. So some schools are starting to make that note. If you already have a list of schools that you're building, go onto their websites, check out, see if they've made any policy updates just yet.
All right, so now if you're taking the test, what do these changes actually mean? Of course, we talked about some of the timing and the format changes. You're going to get a lot more time per question, which is a big deal on the ACT, as any of you who have done it know. But there's some things about the test and the scoring that you might not necessarily anticipate. We wanted to talk about those a little bit from our perspective. So these less obvious effects on your score include the fact that there are many fewer scored questions on this test. So as Jamie was talking about, they're cutting the time a bit, they're cutting the number of questions even more. And so that's why you're getting more time per question. The flip side, the good of that, obviously, more time per question. The less good side is that if there's fewer scored questions, there's less room for error. This has been something that we've seen affecting our students taking the digital SAT, especially students who are really shooting for those tippy top scores, like above a 1450, 1500, 1550. So on the ACT, you're talking about like a 34, 35. It gets really hard to get those high level of scores when there's such a little room for error. The second thing is that there's a 3-section composite, which leads to a couple of things. The first is that there's greater weight given to English, math, and reading. So if you're stronger in any of those sections, obviously that's going to benefit you. Maybe less obvious outcome of this is that there's going to be slightly less friendly rounding. And so we'll look into this a little bit since we're looking at an average out of 3 instead of an average out of 4 sections. So to that first point, less room for error. This is just a little simplified diagram, not including the timing, but just including the number of questions. So as you can see from English, as Jamie was saying, we go down from 75 to 50, for math, 60 to 45. For reading, we shave off 4 questions. Science, the questions are staying the same. But on top of that, one of the main reasons why this test is going to feel so much shorter is that we're getting rid of that 20-minute optional 20-minute experimental section that's at the end. And instead, that experimental section is used for the ACT to test out new test questions. So they can see if they're calibrated well in terms of difficulty, that there's nothing unusual about them, that they shouldn't include them in future test administrations. They don't count towards your score, though. So now, instead of having that as a separate section, they're going to be incorporating those experimental sections into the 4 sections that you're completing. So of those 50 questions on the English, 10 are going to be experimental, and so forth, as you can see here. What that nets out in is that there's really only 40 scored questions for the English, only 41 scored questions for the math, only 27 scored for the reading, and only 36 scored for the science. So those are the questions that are actually counting towards your score. Now keep in mind, the ACT scored out of a 36. I think you guys can think about this a little bit already on your own. We've got 27 scored questions on the reading, and it's out of a 36. It's more points than we have questions. So we can definitely expect to see that as you miss 1 question, as you miss 2 questions, that's going to have a really dramatic effect on your score, especially if you're in those top ranges. And this is not only because of the fewer number of questions that we're looking at, but also because the scales on the ACT and the SAT, for that matter, are designed to sort of spread out the performance of students, particularly at the top and the bottom ranges. So already, even with the current reading and science of the ACT that has many more scored questions than this, the 40 scored questions for each, you will see scales in which you missed 1 or 2 questions, and that brings you down to a 32 or a 33 on the reading or the science. So we expect that that's going to be even more dramatic on this new test. And some of that difficulty in breaking into the highest scores that we've seen on the SAT is probably something we're going to be seeing on this new ACT as well. Here, this is actually a slide pulled from the ACT's own presentation about how going down to 3 sections gives different section weight. So I'm going to break this down student by student. The first 2 I think are a little obvious, and those are the cases in which either you're relatively good at science compared to your other section scores, like student A, or you're relatively not as good at science compared to your other section scores, as in student B. obviously, these new changes, if your science is optional, is going to benefit you. And if the science isn't included in the composite score, if you're someone like student B, whose science is relatively low. So you can see that their composite here goes from a 19 to a 20, from the old calculated version to the new calculated version. Student A, on the other hand, who did really well on science, their composite score is going to go down from a 21 to a 20, just by calculating it out of the English, the math, and the reading. Now, some of the studies that Marissa was alluding to before about how the ACT is talking about how these scores are super comparable is that they're not really noticing these changes for students affecting more than 1 point. So most of the changes that they've done in their studies so far, they'll say, oh, student might have gone up 1 point, down 1 point. It's not super significant in the grand scheme of things. Might feel a little bit more significant to you personally if you're the one doing it. So a little bit less obvious is student C and student D. So in this case, you can see that science is really not that notable of a score for them. It's kind of in line with their others. Maybe student C has a little bit of a high science. But what ends up happening is when you take that science out of the calculation of the composite, the other 3 sections have more weight. So the fact that student C has a lower math means that their overall composite ends up dragging down a little bit. Fact that student D has a higher English means that their overall composite goes up a little bit once we remove that science. I will finally note that if you're a strong verbal student and you can get really high on the English and the reading and the reading are going to constitute 2/3 of your score now, when it's the English, math, and reading composite. So that is something to consider if those are where your strengths lie. Give me a sec. Doesn't look like the slides are moving. Here we go. Okay, so let's talk about the rounding now. So you'll see in these slides, I'm using EMRS for English, math, reading, and science. That's the current composite. EMR for English, math, reading. That's the new one. With the rounding, so I've given out, when you're rounding out of 4, or sorry, when you're taking the average out of 4, there's 4 different ways that your score could end. It could end in 0.00, 0.25, 0.5, 0.75. In the current version of the ACT, 2 of those 4 versions round up. So the rounding kind of actually works in your favor. You could get a 26.5 and then that translates to a 27, which is kind of nice. On the new version, it's a little bit more even cut. So you end with either a 0.00, 0.33, 0.66. One of those stays exactly flat, one of those rounds up, one of those rounds down. So it's not that it's honestly maybe a little bit more fair that way, but the old version kind of lent to itself to your advantage in that 2 of those 4 scenarios would round up to the next whole number score. All right, and here we are, our summary.
Here we are. So just to sum up before we get into some Q&A, the good, more time per question and a shorter test experience. So especially if you're not taking the science section, that timing really does appeal to a lot of students. And if science isn't your thing, you can opt out. I think it's nice to be able to have some control over these exams and have those choices. Now, the less good, like Gretchen talked about, fewer scored questions leads to less room for error. 3-section composite, greater weight to English, math, and reading, and less friendly rounding. Likely to be limited test center availability for digital tests. So you do want to make sure that you're registering way in advance. Even if you're not fully sure, you can always cancel your registration, but make sure you register. We just want you to have a heads up that the digital rollout internationally in 2019 was a bit messy. So just keep that in mind as you're kind of the new group that's going through this first cycle. Remember, this is according to the ACT. We're confident in the research that we've done, the research that we continue to do, that those scores mean the same thing. So this quote from the ACT is in reference to the scoring system for the current and the new versions. The ACT has assured us they have done a good amount of research on their changes, and they do feel that overall, the new version is going to benefit students. And all will be okay. The SAT and the ACT, they both have evolved over the years, and they will most likely continue to do so. And so the best approach is to focus on what's in your control, creating a testing plan with your academic advisor and tutors, preparing for the content of the exam. And reach out to us anytime if you would like to engage in test prep or be able to practice the new version or receive guidance about your score goals, or just if you have any questions in general about testing. Can move into questions now.
Awesome. Okay. Do we have any questions in our Q&A?
I don't think we do.
I think we got one from someone who, when they registered, about how the scores will compare. What if you take the February version, for example, on paper, and then you take the April version and maybe opt out of taking science? Like, how does super scoring work in that realm? Jamie, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, so according to the ACT, they are going to super score it to the science optional version, which means that if you struggle in science in February or in April and you decide to take it without the science in the future, then they're going to super score your previous English, math, and reading scores onto the three-section version of the test. What that means is that there's no real danger to taking the four-section test if you don't like the science. You then have the option of taking it again, either digitally in April, June, or July, or on paper or digitally in the fall, and you'll be able to super score your paper-based test onto the new version. That's at least through the ACT organization. So that's how ACT plans to present your score to colleges. Again, most colleges have not really released their policies about scoring, so remains to be seen whether colleges will accept that system. What I can say is that the SAT, when they rolled out the digital SAT, decided to super score the paper test with the digital SAT. And it seems like colleges all accepted that super score. So I would expect that most schools will accept the super score that the ACT gives them.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially with what you were saying, Jamie, about how the content of this test really isn't changing that much, whereas the content of the SAT really did change quite drastically from the old version to the new. Looks like we have another question in here about, will all new tests be on paper with or without science, or will all new tests will be digital with or without science? I think this is a really good question, because I think even amongst ourselves, we've had this discussion that sometimes we've been using digital ACT interchangeably with new ACT, and that really isn't a good way to talk about it, because the paper one still will exist, at least if you're in the United States. So I'll pull back this slide again. If you're international, I know we had a few international registrants for tonight. You guys know that you've been taking the test digitally for a while now, but you've been taking the current, like, long version of the ACT digitally, and that will continue to be the case until September. Once September comes around, if you're international, you'll be taking the new shorter version. You will also still have only the option to take it digitally. I'm sorry, you don't get as much choice out there. If you're in the US, you have the choice, and you will continue to have the choice between paper or digital for the foreseeable future. The ACT is really positioning itself as the test of choice in contrast to the SAT, and that you can choose whether you want to take it on paper or computer. You can choose whether or not you want to take the science. And they're going to maintain that policy, and they haven't made any announcements about changing that. The main thing that gets a little bit tricky about it, or that you want to pay attention to, is that if you want to take the new version, the shorter version without the science, with the science optional, you must do that on the computer for April, June, and July. Starting in September, you can take that shorter version on paper as well. So the paper is going to remain it's going to remain available to you. It will remain exactly the same as it currently is for the next few administrations through the spring and the summer. Come fall, everything will be the new shorter version of the test, regardless of whether you take it on paper or on the computer.
So we got a great question. Is there going to be a progression of difficulty like there will be on the digital SAT? The answer to that is no. It is going to be a static test, which I think has a few advantages. It means that everybody gets to see the same batch of questions, and you don't have to rely on their grading of difficulty level across different questions. The other thing that it allows is more transparency. The ACT has always been a more transparent test. They have consistently had a practice of releasing anywhere between 2 and 4 of their exams over the years that they give. And so I would expect that they're going to continue releasing exams to the public so that we'll have more comprehensive materials for practice, and we'll be able to see how the test evolves, if it does, as time moves on.
In terms of what they've actually released so far, we kind of have this as an extra slide in case we had extra time. So far, the ACT has released one shortened version of the test. You can take it on their website. A big caveat to that is that it does not have a scale to it. So while you can take that test and kind of experience how much time you have and how much nicer it feels to have that extra time per question, you're not going to have really any feedback about whether that raw score that you get is what that translates to. Is it a 28? Is it 30? Is it a 32? Is it a 34? You're not going to get that feedback just now. The ACT is supposedly going to be putting out another shorter test in the beginning of February that does have a scaled score to it, or does have a scale to it. So we're really looking forward to learning more about that if they do release that on time. And in the meantime, in our back end, we've had a digital platform for students to be able to take these tests on ever since 2019, when the old, longer version of the ACT rolled out digitally internationally. So our platform is well prepared to help students prepare for the digital test. We are going to be putting shorter versions of the ACTs that we have currently that we are going to be trimming down according to the specs and the tests that the ACT has released, so our students can practice on them. So there is practice material. Again, the big caveat is that that practice material is not going to be as good for predicting what your score might look like as the current paper ACT practice material is for the current version of the test.
Just to piggyback on that quickly also, the digital SAT, when they did roll out their practice tests in the Blue Book software, did give scales. What we found is that they don't seem to match the scales from the actual exams. It seems like the difficulty of the questions and of the scales on the real tests have been a little bit tougher than the ones that they initially released on Blue Book. So even the scales that are released for their next shortened test, I think, should be taken with a grain of salt. They're not going to be based on actually administering the exam to a real group of students. They're going to be estimates off of a much smaller sample size. So I wouldn't necessarily take those as, as pure fact.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jamie. All right, do we have any other questions from the audience? Jamie and Marissa, anything else that you wanted to make a point of that people should know?
I don't think so. I think we threw out a lot of information, so we're here and available if questions come up over the next couple days as you're absorbing all of these new changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're here to support you with whatever path you choose. I do think that the paper, or the current version of it, I'm still doing that paper digital thing that I said I shouldn't do. Change always introduces some unpredictability. So I think if you have the option of doing the paper or digital, if I personally were in your shoes, I would stick with the current longer version for as long as I can. You can always pivot to the newer version later on. And we're going to be learning a lot about how this rolls out throughout the next few administrations, the April, the June, and the July. So we'll have more to report back to all of you as we get into the new school year from what those administrations looked like for the students that did opt in to take them.